every time you see God's name written by this particular scribe, you'll see it written like that.
Really?
Because there is a tradition. Not everyone writes God's name like this.
Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon, and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm here today in London, England, with Aviella Barclay, who is a Soferet Stam. She is a professional Jewish scribe who writes Stam, which is Torah scrolls, phylacteries, and mezuzahs, right? Do you write all three of those?
I do write all three of those.
Wow. So I wanted to start off with, we were discussing before we started about whether you're a Sofer Stam or a Soferet Stam. Soferet is the feminine. Normally what people say, and by normally I mean every time I've almost in my life ever heard the term, it was Sofer Stam.
Yep.
And Stam is an acronym for Sefer Torah Tefillah Mezuzah, Torah scroll, phylactery, and mezuzahs, which you'll talk about and we'll talk about. So you're a Soferet Stam. You self-identify as a woman, and you are a woman. So,
that's right.
Okay. You self-identify as Soferet Stam because you are. So,
yes.
So is it unusual? I feel like I'm asking a loaded question. It is unusual to be a Soferet Stam. Of all the working professional scribes in the world, let's put it that way, what percentage are Sofrot feminine versus Sofrim masculine?
Well, I couldn't put an exact number on it.
Okay.
But it is very unusual.
Okay.
But it's getting less and less unusual all the time. Mm-hmm. So that's the important part. The very vast majority of Hebrew ritual scribes, and I'm not just talking about being able to do Hebrew calligraphy. Mm-hmm. It's not only Hebrew calligraphy. It's Hebrew calligraphy weighed down by thousands of rules and centuries of tradition.
Yeah.
So it's...
And when you say thousands of rules, you literally mean thousands of rules.
I mean...
Oh boy, here we go.
Thousands of rules.
So that's the book full of the rules for being I like the term Hebrew ritual scribe.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's the best way to describe it in English myself.
Yeah.
But
that's a good description.
Because there's a lot of ritual attached to it, and the items that we create are used ritually. So it doesn't include everything. Obviously, a ketubah, a Jewish wedding contract, is also used in ritual. It's used in a wedding, right? And so is a get, a Jewish divorce, used in a ritual. But anyone can write those. You just have to make sure that you are writing them correctly.
So I think we need to back up here for the audience.
A little bit.
So this is almost a profound concept. So let's start with the fact that Jews today write scrolls, which is an ancient technology which most of the world stopped using, let's say on a wide basis in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century, something like that. Jews were using scroll, and this is actually a bit debated.
Right, because different cultures moved over to codices at that point, like what we know as a book now, and didn't keep using scrolls,
Right, but Jews continued to use scrolls, even for non-ritual texts, up until probably, we believe, the 8th century, and we believe is another way of saying this is what scholars guess, based on almost no evidence.
Well, we have that dark period, don't we?
Right.
Where there's like very little written material. It's just poof for a few centuries, as you know.
Yeah.
And then, oh, it's back again. It's like someone turned out the light, and now it's back on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it ends with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and more particularly the Bar Kokhba scrolls in 135 CE. And then the next time we have written manuscripts, it's a bit debatable, but it's sometime around the 800s. Maybe there's one or two things from the 400s and the 700s. There could be a few things like that, but they're generally Torah scrolls, which is kind of the point we're trying to get to. But as far as codices or codexes, that is book form, those start to show up in the 800s. And full-blown in the 900s, they're the standard thing. People are still using Torah scrolls, even today, though, in the 21st century.
Yep.
So let's start with that. Why are Jews using a technology that went out of vogue in the 3rd century CE or the 9th century, depending which community you were in? Why are they still using that in the 21st century? That's the question.
Well, there's a lot of reasons. If you want the practical reason, then obviously book technology did change, and it changed at different rates and with different materials, right? So, I mean, inks changed, styluses changed depending on the place, and we got different materials also coming from different parts of the world. So, we didn't have paper until China invented it, and then it made its way over, for example. We used to only use gavil, right? This more tanned leather until parchment was invented in
papyrus
Turkey.
Existed though, but we still didn't use papyrus.
No, that's true. Well, papyrus earlier, obviously, because that's basically the advent of writing, where we used, when I say we, I mean humanity who was writing, were using reeds such as this that come from the Middle East. This is Iranian reed. I mean, that's what we would call it now. It's a Persian reed. And they would write on papyrus.
Is that because it came from Iran, or is that a style of reed?
You can grow it in other places. I didn't import this from Iran, no.
Okay.
But that's a valid question.
No, so it's a style of reed.
It's a variety of reed. There's different kinds of. I mean, I'm not a plant specialist. Okay. I'm not a botanist.
You mean the style of the actual plant? The actual
plant, yeah, not the way it's cut. No.
So let's talk about that for a second. The classic image that we have for most people, I think, is that people were, Moses was sitting around and there was a feather coming out and he was, writing a scroll. Did Moses use a feather, a quill?
Moses did not use a quill.
Okay.
Moses did not use a feather. Pretty much guarantee that. Basically, all writing with ink and stylus back then, like Egyptian times, and would have been done on papyrus and using a reed. And in the beginning, it was.
What do you mean by stylus? Tell us.
Oh, when I say stylus, I just mean any pointy thing, as it were. I mean, these aren't pointy per se because they're cut, as you can see, so that they have a broad nib. And they're all cut in slightly different ways. This one here, this one was actually made for me by a Bukharan sofer, who's a friend of mine.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that is how they cut, and he's a sofer. So that's how they cut reeds in Bukhara, if you're a Jew.
And Bukhara is Central Asia, where there were Jews up until the fall of the Soviet Union, when they were all ethnically cleansed. But
and some escaped to the U.S. and some escaped to Israel, and there's still like a little valley, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, you should talk to a friend of mine, Reuven. He's an expert. He's a Bukharan Jew in the United States.
Okay.
So a stylus is, I mean, it can.
So a reed is a type of stylus.
Yeah. Because a stylus is a more general term. A stylus could also be, you could maybe refer to this as a stylus. This is my bone folder. It's made out of elk bone.
Wait, what is that?
A bone folder is something that you use in bookbinding, but you also use it in sofrut. So you can use it.
Sofrut's the Hebrew word for scribal art, scribal.
Yes.
Okay.
So when you're writing or repairing, Sifrei Torah, right? Sifrei Torah, or Tefillin, or Mezuzot, or actually Megillot as well, Megillah Esther, the Book of Esther.
Okay.
You use this to score the lines, because you have to imprint the lines into the parchment.
Okay. That's what you use.
And it's what I use.
Okay.
My husband, who you have already interviewed, he uses actually a wooden dowel with a rose thorn. Because that's what his teacher taught him, and we have different teachers. So so as long as this is either vegan or comes from an animal that is kosher if you were to eat it. So elk is fine, because elk is a kind of deer, and deer are ruminants. They chew their cud and have cloven hooves. So according to the Torah, we're allowed to eat them. Then you can use
delicious,
it to.
I can say from personal experience.
You can get, where I'm from in Canada, you can get kosher bison and venison.
I've had elk.
Num num num. Yeah, oh yeah. So you can use it for burnishing as well, and you can, I was actually used this last week to burnish, because I had to.
Tell us what you mean by burnishing.
Burnishing is when you want to flatten a surface. So if you're going to do, say, for example, gold leaf, which we're not allowed to do in Stam, that is a specific rule that they discuss actually in the Talmud, saying you cannot put gold letters in a Torah scroll. Otherwise, that invalidates the whole thing. But when I make Judaica, like ketubot, wedding contracts, or prayers, or whatever, psalms for people, then if they want to have gold leaf, then I will burnish it. You can use a stone. You can use something like this. It just gives the metal a really lovely mirror-like finish, so that it's brighter.
So I want to go back to this. So you said that anybody can write a. You said anybody can write a. Well, what were the things?
Well, a get you really need to be Jewish and a scribe, because there's so many rules attached to gittin.
Okay.
Because
and the get is the divorce.
And in a way,
certificate of divorce.
Right, and the certificate of divorce in some ways is actually more important than the wedding contract, because at least in Judaism, or ancient Judaism, the ketubah was important because then it outlined the responsibilities and duties and rights, etc., of a husband and a wife, and that is important. But a get was more important in some ways because we needed to be really clear who was free to marry whom. But a ketubah, as long as you know Hebrew well enough, or Aramaic, however text you're going to use, to not make an error, then you're good to go. But with a get, you really do need to be a Jewish scribe. It's really more of a closed practice. A lot of Judaism is a closed practice.
What do you mean by a closed practice?
I mean, like, only Jews can do it, and some of the practices are only for certain kinds of Jews. So, for example, I'm not a Kohen. I'm never going to be the high priest, so I don't need to know any of those rules, although it's very interesting. If I were ever invited to do anything that a high priest would do, for example, I would not do it because it's not for me. That's all. So that is closed to me. It has nothing to do with my gender. It has to do with the fact that I'm a Yisrael. I'm just a regular Jew. I'm not from that lineage, right? And it's the same with anything Levitical. And again, some people would say, well, it's also because of your gender, but it's not for me. So it's the same thing. Certain things are for everybody. Certain things are just for Jews. Certain things are just for certain kinds of Jews, because we have a hierarchy.
So this is really interesting. I want to nitpick here on a small point you just made in passing, which is that there are three categories of, I'm going to call them Jews.
Yeah.
There's Kohen, Levi, and the third category isn't called Yehudi, Jew, it's Yisrael, which is just another way of saying a regular Israelite.
An Israelite, yeah.
Who's not a Kohen, meaning a priest, or not a Levi. That's really interesting. So, all right. So let's go back to, all right, so we've got...
the technology.
Yeah.
Why are we still using this technology in the 21st century?
Yeah.
Well, on the one hand, tradition is really important in Judaism. Any kind of Judaism. It doesn't matter what brand or denomination of Judaism someone may ascribe to. It's still been influenced by our tradition to one extent or another. And when it comes to the Masorah, the tradition, with scribal practice, although there is more than one way of doing it, it's definitely a very specific tradition, and it has always been done like ish mepi ish. So literally mentored from man to man. It literally means like from the mouth of one man to another. But in my case, it would be Isha, because I'm a woman. So it's been handed down for hundreds of years, thousands of years. When I say that, there have been, as you know, there have been some evolution of the tradition. And depending on what part of the Jewish diaspora someone may have learned, then, they might do something differently. So, for example, a Mizrahi or a Yemenite or a Maghrebi or a Sephardi scribe is more likely to use a reed. It can just be bamboo. It doesn't have to be a particular kind of reed. Than a feather, because really the Ashkenazi, the Western European Jews and Eastern European Jews, they were using feathers. And why is that? Because when Jews started moving into Europe during Roman times, the further north we got, we realized that the reeds didn't grow. Like the same varieties of reeds don't grow in Europe as grow in the Middle East and the Near East. So you could not... This is one of the reasons why Europe could never have invented writing, at least not in this way, is because the reeds that grow here, you can't use as a pen. So there's actually a halakha, there's a rule in here that talks about, you have to use a reed. You must never use anything else but a reed. We always use reeds. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And then another voice chimes in, because we have multiple voices. This is a collection of many, many sources over the generations. And another voice chimes in and says, "Oh, what about feathers? We can use feathers, can't we? Why did we start using feathers? Because we all use feathers." And then the answer comes, well, why do we use feathers? Because they don't make reeds like they used to.
Wow. So it was a practical consideration in Northern Europe. That's
Christian scribes used feathers, and we could not find the reeds. So we started using feathers, just like there's depending on where Jews lived, they would adopt Islamic book arts, perhaps because of the materials available, or out in China, right? You've seen Kaifeng Torah scrolls, right? Those are also made differently because of the available book arts and the available sort of technologies.
Oh, the I was going to say parchment, but I know that's not correct.
It's more like an Allen Todd. It's like Allen Todd goat. It's like a white leather. It's white like parchment.
It's the coolest material I've ever seen. Isn't it amazing? Torah scroll.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The Chinese scrolls are just so distinctive.
The other thing I wanted to say about the tradition is the fact that we can't just print them or silk screen them or whatever, because the thing that puts the sanctity into them, because you're obviously well aware of the kind of kavod, the kind of respect that we pay to Torah scrolls, for example, and the deference we have for these objects, not in any inappropriate way. It's not worshiping the objects, obviously, but they, as a vessel, hold the word of God. And what's important is that the person who writes them has the appropriate kavanah, the appropriate intention, and the right sort of holy consciousness. And that is what imbues these things with the sanctity. That's why you have to say each word before you write it. You have to say each letter before you write it. And you have to make a special declaration every time you're going to write God's name, because you're never supposed to write God's name.
What's the declaration?
Well, it's basically I'm writing this name for the sake of the sanctity of the holiness of the name. And some people also say it as though, because it's, for the sanctity of this particular piece of stone, whatever it is. So if it's a Sefer Torah or a mezuzah or something like that. But you need to do that. And there's different traditions around that. Some say you have to make a special dip of your pen.
Really?
Yeah, and have that consciousness even when you're dipping. And then others say, if you dip, you still need to test your pen, because you don't want to dip and then write, because if you make a blob, then you've blotted God's name, and that's very...
And you can't erase the mistake, the blob mistake, right?
No, you can't. That's one of the many, many rules. Okay. You can only correct by adding ink, and you can't correct by carving away or shaping. That's another reason why we can't have things like screen printing and stuff like that. So although we have books that we use in the synagogue, obviously, that are a printed version that we can read, we can't have like a public reading. We need to have a scroll, and we need to have somebody who is minimally observant, Shabbat, kashrut, that sort of thing, to be writing those things for us.
So I want to dwell on this point for a minute. So, and this is a key. I feel like that maybe I wonder if the audience is missing. I wouldn't assume they know this. Let's put it that way. That there are these three ritual objects: a Torah scroll, phylacteries, and we can describe what that is, I suppose, and mezuzahs, which again can show us there actually, but let's hold on to that.
Okay.
There are these three ritual objects that have to fulfill certain specifications and be prepared in a certain way in order to be valid for ritual use. That's basically what it comes down to. Is that right?
Yes, and there's a long chain of that. It begins actually well before the scribe. It begins with when you're making the skin, the hide, into parchment. Actually, it starts with the animal. The animal has to be kosher. The feather that you write with has to come from a kosher bird that you would be allowed to eat.
So you can't use like an eagle's feather?
Never, ever.
Okay.
Then the whole thing is not kosher. The whole thing is pasul. Yeah. And if you did something like that, and then you sold it to someone and they didn't know, all the blessings they would say on that would be in vain, and they would all land on you.
Okay.
So there's going to be a special place in the afterlife for people who do that.
So just so the audience understands, so there is this, and it's not just a tradition, meaning it's a halakhically binding, if you consider it binding, like ritual that you hear the Torah read every week in the synagogue. And if the Torah is read from a scroll that wasn't prepared according to all these specifications, then you haven't fulfilled the duty. Is that essentially what it is?
It's essentially true. Now, we're very lucky that God is merciful. So if it's just through a mistake, then, you know, humans do make mistakes. And that's one of the reasons why when you write something like a Torah scroll, not only do you have to be so careful about copying it exactly from another Torah scroll, or for a book that we call a Tikkun L'Sofrim. I have a little bit of one. I have just Bereshit here, just Genesis. It's just a small, and it has all of the top and the bottom of the columns, and it has little codes on it, so it tells you how much you have to stretch or cramp your letters, and it also tells you if one of God's names is coming up. You see, it says Kodesh over here, because there are some words that can refer to idols or you know, things that are not God. So you have to be careful not to sanctify those, because
that's really interesting. So I saw a Torah scroll when I was doing my research. Where there's a phrase where it says Elohei Adoni Avraham. It's in Genesis 24.
Right.
The God of my Lord Abraham. And the word Adoni was cut out, leaving a blank space, and then rewritten in very small letters above the line. And it's very clear to me, at least, that what the scribe did is he wrote Elohei, and then he wrote, instead of Adoni, he wrote the exact same 4 letters, but with the thought that it was one of God's titles. And so when he realized that, he's like, oh no, I wrote a sacred name here, even though, I mean, Adoni is my Lord, referring to Abraham.
Right,
but he wrote the Lord, referring to God.
Yes.
And so he had to cut it out, because now he has a holy name where it doesn't belong, even though it's graphically identical to the word that means my Lord.
Yes.
Right? Meaning, from the perspective of anybody besides that scribe who would have looked at that, could never even theoretically know that it was done wrong.
No.
But he knew.
Right. And that is exactly why you have to be able to trust your scribe, like you trust your lawyer, your doctor, your jeweler, etc. You need to be able to trust them 100%. Not that they'll never make a mistake, but that if they do make a mistake, they will make it right, and they'll be honest about it.
Okay,
you know,
so
I've made mistakes. It's awful, but it happens. And just to add to your story, some opinions would say that he shouldn't have just cut that name out. He would have pasuled the entire Uriah, the entire sheet of parchment, and he would have had to start that sheet again. Just rewrite that entire sheet. And he would have had to bury that.
This is in the Middle Ages. They quite routinely cut out you know, the name of God. And you
can still do that. I mean, you're really supposed to cut out other things on either side and not just the name of God. But again, there's different opinions. So, and practice has changed, like I said, not just by location, but over time to some extent.
Yeah, I found one passage where it talked about if you left out a word, that what it talks about in the medieval literature is you write it above the line. And this rabbi in the 19th century or something, he says, don't write it, you know, today nobody will know what that is and they'll be confused, so don't do it. Because they're not used to it. So back in the day, meaning even 400 or 500 years ago, they would routinely write entire verses above the line.
And I've seen that.
And now they don't do it, or if they do, it's extremely rare, I suppose.
Yeah, it's very practical, though, to be able to do that, and it's not ideal. But at the same time, I mean, when you come across that, it's like, oh, okay, well, at least you caught the mistake. You know. It's
probably more common, I would think, like in an Esther scroll. So let's go back to this. So we have Torah scroll, Tefillin, which is phylacteries, and mezuzah. An Esther scroll, does that have to be written with the proper intent? Meaning there's a certain intent that goes into writing those first 3 things, right? And that's why you need to trust the person. Like whenever you write God's name, you have to be thinking, this is a holy name, right? And you're saying some people even say the words, I'm writing this for the sake of...
And say each letter as well.
Tell me that.
Well, I mean, because that's one of the ways you avoid making a mistake, is if you look at your layout guide, if you look at your tikkun, and you go, okay, and you've got that isolated so that you're not accidentally writing something from a different line.
Open that up and show me a place where it has God's name.
Okay.
And tell me what you would do when you got to that.
Okay, so right here, for example, it says Kodesh
holy.
Here, right? So you go along and you go, oh, look, here we go.
Okay.
And there's a circle above it, you know, and there's actually another one down here.
Okay.
See?
Let's
circle above
find
it.
my favorite one, the Tetragrammaton. So I don't know, open up to, I know it's all over the place here, so, let's see, no, that's Elohim.
There's also instances where it says whole, because it might be referring to idols or something like that. So
Right.
it makes sure that you don't sanctify it.
Right.
So it also takes your attention to,
Like,
at
for
that.
example, in Ten Commandments, where it says, Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim, you shall not
Right.
have other
Exactly.
Elohim.
Exactly.
So Elohim there
Like in
doesn't
the
refer to
mezuzah.
God.
No,
Okay.
don't go out. Don't go after other gods. That's
Okay.
right. So you can't sanctify that word because you're talking about the other gods.
So you have to make sure not to sanctify that word.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Otherwise, you start again, and that's your punishment.
Well, we'll talk about the mezuzah because that's fascinating in and of itself. That's like a special case, right? Of course, when I want to find it, I'm not finding it.
This is exactly the same for me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know there's one here in Genesis 15.
I'll tell you another story while you're
Yeah,
looking for it.
Tell me.
So I was writing part of. Oh, yeah, that's not what you're looking for.
Which
This
one?
is not the God's name you're looking for.
Oh, right. Okay. So I'm looking for where it says Kodesh here. Okay.
You're looking for where it says Kodesh,
Okay.
and then go across, and you can. So here we've got
Right.
Kel.
So I've
we've
seen
got-
other ones where it's like underlined,
Yeah,
and then it'll write
Right.
above it Kodesh.
yeah. Sometimes they
Holy.
do that as well. It's different depending on the layout guide. There's
Okay.
different ways of doing it, as long as they get your attention.
Here is okay. So that is Aleph Dal Nun Yud. All right.
And that's Kodesh.
Um,
There are
yeah.
instances where the little word on the side, instead of Kodesh or Chol, it actually says Safek, which means, here we
so
go.
tell us about
There's
that.
Chol. See?
Okay.
So here we go. This is Chol. So you do not sanctify that. It's already warned you.
So
Don't
here
do
it
it.
says.
Don't do it.
Okay. It says Rak la'anashim ha'el, only to these people, and ha'el means these. But it could also, if you didn't have a context, it could be God.
And if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, or if you
Right.
don't understand what it says,
Right.
it needs to be all those things, right?
Wow. So you have to mentally form an intent in your mind that, okay, when I write this word, here's an example of Adoni, my Lord, right? Not referring to God. And it says Chol,
It says Chol.
which means non-holy,
Right.
or non-sacred. So that, we'll talk about this in a second. So that's interesting. I was trying to explain this to someone, and I actually wrote an academic journal article, and I referred to non-sacred words.
Yeah.
And one of the peer reviewers said, what do you mean? Isn't every word in the Torah sacred? Yeah, but not in this context, meaning a sacred word is one of the 7 or 10 names of God or
Right,
titles
yeah.
of God, and everything else is non-sacred. Even a title of God like Rachum, merciful one. So that is considered non-sacred,
No,
meaning
yeah.
you're allowed to erase
So
it.
yeah,
that was what I meant.
there are 7 that you have these extra special rules applied to them. But yes, in theory, in Judaism, God has like 100 names.
Right.
You know, Harachaman, the merciful one.
Right. But those you're allowed to erase by
Yes.
traditional law.
Yep.
By halakha, which
They also
means they're
don't-
considered chol, they're considered non-sacred. All right, so here we're in Genesis 19, verse 5, and it's talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it says, Yud, He, Vav, He.
Right. And it
it
says
has
Kodesh.
and it says holy.
And there's a little
So how would you
circle
do
above it.
this? You come to this, you're a scribe, you're working, you're
I get-
writing a Torah scroll.
I get
what
to
do you
that
do?
so I get to that line, and I generally will have, something over like that, and I just move this down so that I
That
right?
is so cool. You know why
That's-
that's cool? Wait, I don't know if people saw that. So she has something that makes sure she only copies from the line she's on and not another line.
It is so easy to copy from the wrong line because you
Right.
often have repetition as well.
So there are so many manuscripts, Torah scrolls even, where we have these scribal errors where it's clear that the scribe's eye jumped as he was looking back and forth at his source, and his eye jumped from one line to the next line, and he missed an entire line.
Yeah.
And then he has to come back, and he has to scratch out 5 lines and rewrite them as
not
4,
funny.
or 4 rewrite them as
Yeah,
5,
yeah.
right? Different scenarios.
That is where
And
your burnisher comes in handy.
Okay.
So you can re-prepare the surface of the parchment
So first,
so you don't get sort of furry letters. You want to have nice, sharp
Well,
letters.
sometimes they get furry letters. And sometimes the entire page after 800 years, the entire sheet is all the ink is flaked off, except for those 5 lines that he rewrote. there the ink stuck better. And then sometimes it's the opposite. Everything is intact except for those lines. All right. So you come to here and you mark off so you don't go to the wrong line. And you write ki mashchit normally.
Yeah. The other thing,
now what do you do?
The other thing you do is, I mean, what I do is I always have paper, just printer paper, just normal paper, craft paper, whatever, down on top of the naked parchment, like the blank stuff that I haven't written on yet. And then I will have this, like where I'm writing, I'll have this like very close at hand so that I have it right in front of me. And then, like I said, I'll cover everything up.
So this is what you're copying from.
Right. So I basically isolate everything that I'm doing to avoid mistakes, partly because, again, some of them have tremendous significance and consequences, and other times you just don't want to waste your time. Like, let's face it, it's backbreaking work, literally. So then I would come to this, and then I'd go, oh, okay, so ki, so chaf, yud. And
Do you say the word ki?
Yeah.
You say it out loud?
Yeah.
Okay, so you say the word because.
This is what I was taught. Now, I can you can speak to other sofrim, sofrot, ask them what they were taught, and some of it will be exactly the same, and some of it will not be. So, right. And you just do that, and then, but you take notes.
I want to stop you for a second. That is so interesting.
What?
So one of the things I found in the medieval literature as I was working on my PhD dissertation is that there's two types of approaches to and I was dealing with Torah scrolls in God's name. So there's two approaches. One is we examine in great minutia and detail the Talmud and the writings of Maimonides, and we come to the conclusion, what is the law? And there's a completely different approach, which is we go and we ask the scribe down the street. And you'll have some of the top rabbis of the Middle Ages, they'll say, well, yes, we're supposed to do X, Y, Z, but I asked the scribes, and here's what they do.
Right.
And that's what I refer to as scribal praxis, meaning what do they do? In Hebrew, we say minhagei sofrim.
Yeah.
What is the actual practical thing done by scribes? And that might not line up with what the legal texts say. And that's because the people who wrote the legal texts may not have known how to actually write a Torah scroll.
They may not have been scribes.
And they say
not all scribes are rabbis.
So there are three professions that required very specialized knowledge that even someone like Maimonides may not have had, which was a scribe, a stam scribe, meaning specifically of Torah scrolls, tefillin and mezuzahs, a mohel, a circumciser, and a shochet, somebody who slaughters animal. Now, you might read all the books in the world about how you're supposed to perform circumcision. I'm going to trust the guy who was taught by the other guy who did 1,000 of them before he let the new guy do even one. And then supervise him. I'm not going to trust the guy who read a bunch of books.
No.
And so this is kind of a specialized...
You cannot be self-taught with this. You cannot be self-taught with any of those things.
Right.
So
that's fascinating.
Because it's actually not about you. It is about you in that you are bringing this, and you are the vessel, and you are providing it, and you are serving. So... but you're not allowed to sign it, and you don't, right? Other than that, this is the way that you are serving God and you're serving your community. So it's not about you, it's about everyone out there.
Talk about you're not allowed to sign it.
Who's going to be reading it. Like, you have to think about, am I writing it? Okay, is what I've written kosher, so it's fine, but is it hard to read? Is it ugly?
So I want to go to that. So when you write a Torah scroll, you can't sign it at the end and say this was done by Aviella.
No, never, ever.
Okay.
Not a Torah scroll.
Okay.
That's another one of those very specific laws. Now, that being said, I did come across when I was, this is one of my little stories. I have a million of them because I've been doing this in October. It'll be 20 years since I earned my te'udah, since I officially became a soferet. I started studying I started Hebrew calligraphy from the 90s. And then I've been a Judaic artist since 1994. And then from 97, I started learning sofrot. And then it took me, because I was living in Canada. I was living in Victoria.
So sorry for that.
And
that you were living in Canada. I'm just kidding. The Great Northern Wasteland.
Yes. Some of my ancestors actually emigrated to the United States, and then they fought on the side of the British during the American War of Independence.
I see.
Yeah, and now it's on tape.
Okay.
And obviously they lost. So they were given land in Ontario. They were given free...
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were given free farms in Ontario. They negotiated with the local First Nations people, and they were given farms in Ontario as a reward from the king, and they were given titles, and it's the only title that's recognized in Canada.
Really?
United Empire Loyalist.
Wow.
And I know all of this is irrelevant, so it's going to be edited out.
No, we should keep this. This
You're
is
the one that made the comment
but
about being sorry that I'm Canadian.
But now you're a refugee in the United Kingdom. All right, let's move on. So
I'm a UK citizen.
Okay.
I'm both.
All right. So you let's finish this.
So we don't even know what we were talking about now.
No, let's go back to this. So you wrote the word key. I think we lost our place. We're now on page 9. Where were we? Weren't we in? We had a case. Oh, here it is. Ki mashchit.
Right.
So you actually say each word as you're writing.
So then, and then when you come to the end of mashchit, then
presumably you don't say God's name.
You don't. Well, we don't know how to say God's name, really, do we? I know there's a debate about that.
That's a separate conversation.
It is a separate conversation. But what I would say is, I would make the verbal declaration that I am about to write this holy name for the sake of the mitzvah of Sefer Torah and for the sake of the holiness of the name. And that does not give you permission to write it, because really you still should only ever write any of these of God's names in stam, in like ritual items. You're not supposed to just be writing it all over the place. I saw online someone was like printing them on cushions, and I was just like, please don't do that. You know, you don't want people sitting on God's name on cushions. Anyway,
okay.
Well, you know, and then you would say Yud, Hey, Vav.
So you would pronounce out each of the 4 letters.
I would say each of the 4 letters, and I would still look each time. I know how to write this name.
Right. Right?
It's stamped, like Simeni Kachotim Alebecha, right? Like it's stamped on my heart, this name, but I still look and say it and write and look and say it and write, because that's what you do. That's how you don't make a mistake. Sometimes you still make a mistake, hopefully not with any of God's names. You might also notice that the 2 Heys here are written differently.
You see have crowns on them.
This one...
Is that what you're referring to?
No, I mean like the Gog and the Regal, like the roof and the leg here
that's
of that one. That looks like a Dalet. Okay. And this one is rounder like a Resh.
And that's... And
then you see the Yud, the foot here of this Hey is wider, and it's got like a little foot sticking out. And then this one is really narrow. And every time you see God's name written by this particular scribe, you'll see it written like that.
Really?
Because there is a tradition. Not everyone writes God's name like this, but there is a tradition that Yud is the dad, and the first Hey is the mum, and the Vav is the son, and the second Hey is the daughter.
Of what? No, I'm not trying to be
life, the universe, everything. 42. This is, and the 2 Heys are differentiated from each other because mama energy is different than daughter energy. It's not the same. So all mamas are daughters, but they're not all mamas.
I'm lost here. So
it's a family. It's a nuclear family. Not that that's the only way to be a family, but So that
isn't implying God is a family, is it?
No, but it shows that in this particular tradition, there's this idea that being, because we know that the tetragrammaton, as the Greeks call it, that is the verb to be in the present tense, which is why when you're speaking Hebrew, you don't say the verb to be in the present tense, you just skip over it. Right? When you, if you were going to translate it, it would just have that missing. If it was in a different tense.
In most contexts, yeah.
Right, okay, yeah, but you know what I'm talking about. So, and that is because it's being. Right. It's existence.
In other words, when you say
and it's got both genders here.
When you say that, the dog is, I don't know, the boy is big. Yeah. You say hayelad gadol.
Right, the boy big.
And the word is not expressed in Semitic languages usually.
No, that's right, yeah.
In the present tense.
But that's why. Because God is. God is. It's like what it says in the Bible, I am which I am. Which I am, or I am that I am that I will be.
I will be that which I will be. Different ways of translating.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why we don't say it, but it's also why that is that tradition. Now that is not part of the tradition I was taught, because my teacher actually I had 2 teachers. They taught me in more the German tradition. Okay. Mark was taught in more of a Polish tradition, although his teacher was Indian. Then my teachers were sort of Canadian and American, Turkish, Russian. But their teachers were, right? So you teach what your teacher taught you. Okay. So I teach in the German tradition, there's different ways of writing. Like when you've seen my husband Mark's writing, that's very much more Polish. The way I write is like this, and it's much more square. It's much more like, as I like to say, eins, zwei. It's very, it's very square. It's very 0 degrees, 90 degrees. And his is much more dancey. It is a bit rounder because that's generally how the scripts go. And there's different scripts in different countries. But of course, I'm not German. I've never, lived in Germany, but that's the tradition I was taught in. So as you know from looking at manuscripts, you can go, oh, well, it could have been written in a particular country, or it could have just been written like it wasn't necessarily written in this particular country of the diaspora. It might have been written somewhere else by someone who's just trained that way. Because now with people moving around so much, I mean, people always moved around, but
so
it's easier now.
We have a big problem with Italian manuscripts in that, so a lot of manuscripts, of course, is what's called a colophon, which is the section at the end where the scribe says, it was the 3rd day of the week of such and such month in a year, and I wrote this for so-and-so. But most manuscripts, that hasn't survived. And in Torah scrolls, it never existed. There are actually some exceptions, but that's a different story.
I have a story about an exception.
Ooh, I want to hear that.
Okay.
So, there's a bunch of exceptions where the colophon is a forgery, but there's actually a bunch of real exceptions. It's not a forgery. Not when I say a bunch, it's a few dozen maybe that have ever been found. Maybe less than that.
A lot for Megillat Esther.
No, I'm talking about Torah.
I know, but like with Megillah Esther also, like a lot of these Italian ones, like these young women and actually girls that were writing Megillat Esther, 200, 300, 400 years ago.
Yeah.
Some of these Megillah Esther that have been, up for auction in the last several years, and they all have colophons.
Okay.
And some of the Sofrot living today also, have colophons attached to their Megillot Esther.
Oh, just of Esther.
Yeah.
So the problem we have with Italian manuscripts where there's no colophon, or if it's a Torah scroll, is that we have, in the instances where we do have a colophon, we'll sometimes have the same scribe who will write in an Ashkenazi style, which is Northern European German.
Yeah.
The same scribe will write in a Sephardic style. The same scribe will start writing in an Italian style, and it really came down to the patron who bought the manuscript from him, and it's not necessarily a Torah scroll. It could be, a book on medicine. Will say, I want this in the Sephardic handwriting. I want this in the German handwriting. And the scribes in Italy, especially Northern Italy, did all three fluidly, like without a problem. And it just, whoever ordered it and said, this is the style I want, he would write it in that style.
Yeah.
And so you got to be really careful. You look at a style and you're like, oh, that's the writing of Northern Europe. But it was written in Venice.
Right.
So you got to be careful with that.
You do, actually. And actually this Sofer Stam, the Bukharan Sofer Stam I mentioned earlier, who made this for me, he was asked to write a Torah scroll that actually Mark arranged that for him to write for this community. But of course they were Ashkenazi. So they were like, oh, he's Bukharan? What is it going to look like?
We won't be able to read it.
You're right. They'll be just like, we want it to reflect us. So he was like, it's not a problem. I'll write in your way. And he did.
Wow.
So, that was just a few years ago. Yeah.
So tell me about the colophons.
The colophon. Okay. Well, obviously with Megillot Esther, it's quite common, especially with these young women. There have also been notes left behind. There was a Torah scroll that I checked, must have been 15 years ago now. And I won't say the community. I don't tend to announce communities because it's their Torah and their business. But so I was checking it, and I was rolling through, and it obviously, was very old, and it was made up of a couple of different scrolls, and it has been patched together a bit, but very nicely.
It was made up of a bunch of scrolls.
Well, sometimes if a Sefer is part of it's damaged, and you either will rewrite new and attach to that, or you will maybe have different damaged parts and you amalgamate two other scrolls to get one good usable scroll.
I call that a Franken scroll.
Oh, you have not seen the Franken scroll we have at our house.
Okay.
It's literally
and I don't mean that in a negative way.
Patchwork. No, we don't either.
I think Franken scrolls are beautiful because you think you have one scroll and you realize this is actually 10 scrrolls.
So many different traditions.
Exactly. And different periods and different
and it actually
styles.
It takes like a lot of skill to be able to piece these together.
Yeah. Unless it's Yemenite. Because every Yemenite scroll is written according to the same tikkun. So you could take any column from a Yemenite scroll and insert it into any other scroll.
Identical. That's right.
It's identical, at least what's in that column, maybe not what's on each line.
They also have more letters in their Torah scroll than the rest of us.
Really?
Yes, they do. So it's all very well to say the Torah is identical for all Jews and always has been forever. But actually, the Yemenites have, I think it's 11 more letters.
Really?
Yeah. But it doesn't change the meaning of anything, which is important. It's mostly sort of yods and vavs, that sort of thing.
Meaning the spelling is slightly different.
It's just the spelling. So just like in modern Hebrew, they would maybe insert, a vav somewhere that you wouldn't normally have a vav because there's no vowels used in modern Hebrew.
It's worse than that. 2 or 3 years ago, the Academy of the Hebrew Language decided they were going to change the spelling system.
Oh,
so everything written 10 years ago, if it's reprinted today, is supposed to be updated to where, like the word ima, aleph, mem, aleph. For last 2,000 years, it's aleph, mem, aleph. They decided, no, it should be aleph, yud, mem, aleph. Because it's e. Every time we have e, we should put in a yud.
But we don't. But we don't need it.
I don't need it. But that's the rule they made.
Yeah, and we don't make those rules.
So the spelling has changed in our lifetimes, in the lifetimes of babies, right?
I know. That's a good way of putting it, actually. Yeah. God, it's almost like the Académie Française, isn't it? It's just like, we've made a decision, everyone.
Oh no, it's much worse.
We didn't ask any of you, but we've made a decision. So the end of this Torah, so I'm going through this Torah and I'm taking notes, and it needs a little bit of repair, but it's not in too bad a shape because whoever fixed it last did a very good job. And I get to the end and I go, oh, isn't that interesting? There's an extra halakhic I see. So what that means is at the end of the Torah, at the very end, where it ends with the word Yisrael, obviously, I noticed there was more stitching and extra parchment before we got to the actual wooden roller. And I thought, it's probably just because there hadn't been enough at the end, because you really should have more at the end, because then when you roll...
Column? What are you saying?
Well, there's an extra piece. It wasn't just a column, but I mean, you need to have more at both ends anyway, so that the roller doesn't damage the letters at either end. That's just a practical.
Right.
Then I opened it up, and I went, oh, and someone had written on this extra piece, Tikanti. I fixed this.
Are you serious?
I am serious. Very carefully, he wrote, Tikanti, Eliezer Friedman, Pesht, 1947.
Wow.
It gives me chills. Yeah, and I was
he said, I fixed it, so-and-so, and the
His
year
name is Eliezer
and
Friedman.
the place.
And I'm thinking, 1947? What software was in Pesht in 1947 fixing Torahs? Like, that has got to be the most incredible story.
Wow. So let's start with, I'm going to assume he
wrote it all in Hebrew, so.
I'm going to assume he was part of the Neolog movement. And
I don't know anything about. I would love to.
So
I would love to find out who he was.
The largest denomination in Hungary. It's actually one of the oldest denominations in let's say in modern Judaism, right? I mean, it's older than the Reform movement, if I'm not mistaken. It's today it's still the largest denomination in Hungary, and I'm guessing that in the Neolog movement, it's okay to put a colophon. I don't know. I'm making stuff up because I don't know. You're right.
You've got me sitting right here, but you're making stuff up.
Wow. No, meaning I'm making it up in that, like, I'm trying to hypothesize. Why would this have happened?
Yeah. So
this isn't supposed to happen.
Some say that if you do add an extra, you can't write anything on the actual Torah scroll. That is adding to Torah. That is a massive no-no, as you know. But if you sew an extra piece on and maybe write on the back, then that's not adding to Torah. I don't remember. It was a really long time ago.
Wow.
But it was. He did make a point of having extra parchment. Again, 1947 in Pesht. Like, where is he getting this beautiful white new parchment? It was pristine.
Wow.
And he'd taken the trouble of sewing it on and then writing this. And I just thought, I need to, and I asked the rabbi, I was like, where did you get this scroll from? And he's like, I don't know. So I thought, okay. So I've asked around some of the Hungarian Jews and like Hungarian like rabbinical students that I know here in London. And yeah, I don't even know where to begin, but I mean that's crazy. That is going to be a really good story. That's going to be a book, a movie, a miniseries, podcast. You don't know this man's story. It could be amazing.
That is a pretty incredible story.
Yeah.
So the colophons I know about, there's two types. So most of the colophons that are considered authentic are on Karaite Torah scrolls. They're mostly in the Furkovich collection in St. Petersburg. A bunch of those are forgeries, but some of them are actually real. Some of them are authentic.
Really? Are they really authentic?
Well, according to the scholars who studied them in the 19th century, they're authentic, yeah.
I'm sure they know more than I do.
There's one that's definitely authentic that is at Trinity College in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And that's also a Karaite scroll. It's not actually a colophon. It's a vow inscription that the guy had something happen in his life, and he made a vow: if I get through this, I'm going to dedicate a Torah scroll. I'm going to pay for a Torah scroll. And then when he has the Torah scroll written, and at the end he writes out, this is what happened, and there's 10 signatures.
Really?
Yeah,
that is
10
interesting.
Yeah.
So he was like, I made this neder and I have fulfilled my neder.
That's exactly right.
Wow. So 10 signatures. It sounds like maybe he had like a big bet in there, like a minion.
No, it's kind of like, there were 10 witnesses, and
right.
What was it with Boaz? Wasn't there 10 people in the gate of Bethlehem or something? I don't remember. Anyway, so the other example, which is a mystery, is there's a Torah scroll from Otranto, which is southern Italy, in the early 12th century, which has a colophon with a specific date. As far as we know, there were no Karaites in Italy in the 12th century, so you can't blame it on the Karaites in this case. So somebody decided, okay, I can write a colophon in the 12th century. So that already kind of makes sense because it's so long ago. It was before some of these rules crystallized. I mean, the rules were there, but maybe they weren't equally applied everywhere.
Right.
But in 1947, I mean...
Yeah, that's very modern.
Come on, we've got books that have been printed that say this is what you have to do and what you can't do.
As far as the origin, like the very, beginnings of some of these rules, I literally would have to go and research each one to find out where they came from and when they started going into, larger use. We have definitely got stricter and stricter and stricter as we've gone on, which in some ways is helping us write better. And is helping us make things that are easier to read and are very practical as far as the use of the materials and things like that. So those are good, as I would personally define them. But then there are others that are just, sometimes their argument seems to be being strict for the sake of being strict, and I can show you how strict I am, and I don't have a lot of time for that. I know that if that is meaningful for someone in their particular practice, then obviously, bavakasha, please do, because people have to make...
What would be an example of that?
Decisions for themselves. Well, just things to do with, for example, Sefer Tagin, where...
Tell us what that is. I know your husband's writing a PhD on it, but...
Yes, he is writing a PhD on it. He's almost done.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's exciting. How do I explain Sefer Tagin? This is where I go, oh, that's a vague question, and I have a lot of detailed answers. You probably have a more concise answer to that.
I'll give the short answer. It's a book that says you put a little symbol there and another symbol there.
Oh, okay.
I call them doohickeys. You put a little doohickey here, and I'm from the Midwest, and a little doohickey there, and okay, so how are people strict when it comes to Sefer Tagin?
Right, when you say doohickey, okay, so I'll elaborate on your doohickeys, and that is there'll be certain letters that are written differently in order to convey a different idea or to act maybe as lecture notes, which actually the Torah is, as some people will teach, lecture notes. Referring to other things that we are meant to do or other traditions to remind us of other ideas, right?
Some of them we don't know why they're there, right? I mean...
Well, and the thing is, nowadays, if you come across, for example, so one that's very obvious that a lot of people spot right away is the Pei Melufafet or Pei Melufa, which is the letter Pei or Fe, and it's got a spiral in it, or it's got a tiny letter Pei, Fe inside, where the normal little tongue is.
So it doesn't look like a normal Pei. It's like I call it a curly Pei.
Yeah, fine. So, so I have come across many Sifrei Torah that were written 300 years ago, and I've restored those. And I know from a historical point of view, restoring those is not that's not a popular thing. But if you want to keep using something, you have to keep it kosher. So there obviously is a difference between restoration and conservation.
What does it mean that you restored it?
Well, so for example, generally when people bring me an old Torah scroll, they want me to fix it and make it kosher again. So that means if there's missing ink, then I will add ink to the areas where there is
So the
missing
ink
ink.
may have flaked off.
May have flaked off, or it may have corroded because maybe the original recipe of the ink had maybe an imbalance. It was too acidic, so it would have crumbled away. Maybe too much iron or something if it happens to be iron gall ink, that sort of thing. Or it could be that it was stored in like less than ideal conditions, which most of them are, let's face it, because most people don't understand how to treat parchment nowadays because it's not ubiquitous like it used to be. Although, to be fair, most people weren't literate either. So, I mean, they wouldn't even come across parchment. But maybe it's cracked. Maybe the ink is totally fine, but there's a tiny crack. So the second the letter is not got any integrity, then the whole Torah is not kosher.
So what do you do to that? How do you fix the letter that's cracked?
So for something like that, you would add ink, for example.
Okay.
If you have a torn seam, then obviously we can sew it together. I have something here called gidin, and it is made also from a kosher animal. And generally, it's just made by a couple of families that live in Eretz Israel, who live in Israel, and it's their parnassa. It's the way they've been supporting themselves financially for
these
generations.
Are sinews or something, right?
It is the sinew from the back end of the animal, basically the Achilles tendon and the hamstring area. But what they do is you can see, what they do is they card it, they dry it and card it, and then they spin it into really fine. Sorry, I have an agricultural background as well. Okay. So carding, so they're these special sort of like brushes with metal teeth. And you do the same thing with wool, right? Okay. But I mean, machines do it now. People don't tend to hand card wool from their sheep. And they're very flat and they've got these metal teeth and you basically comb them like back and forth like this. And that lines all the fibers up in the same direction. And then that's when you can spin it. Because if the fibers aren't all lined up in the same direction.
And they do that with these sinews.
They do it with the sinews, yes. So they come out of these. So the animals that have, so that is what we sew them together with, the sheets. So, and with a gold-plated or a silver-plated needle, not everybody does that. That's my tradition.
Well, why gold-plated? I never heard that.
Some scribes will not use like steel or any kind of base metals when they are writing or repairing any of these articles. Okay. And I say repairing lightly because you can't always repair them. So that's but others just use normal needles, but I use silver or gold plated, and that way you have a fine metal. And unfortunately and I say unfortunately because it comes down to even when I am like using a blade or a knife or something like that. And believe it or not, I can plate silver just by wiping it. There's a way of doing it. You can you can basically, like electroplate without using electricity onto the blade, but then even those molecules will make it less sharp. And you can see, you can feel how it's a different blade. Yeah, just adding a few molecules. Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, this is really interesting. Hold on a second. So if you have a mistake in a Torah scroll, and you have to erase a word and it's not God's name, how do you erase it?
Well, it depends. I have a series of erasers that are okay to use because they're considered kosher or vegan or just neutral. They don't contain any like non-kosher animals, for example. So that way it fits the halakha, right, the Jewish law component, but also you have to respect the materials. So you need to use like materials and techniques that are going to respect the materials that you're trying to fix and not cause any damage or not have any kind of like long-term negative consequence.
Do you have one of those erasers here?
They're over there. But I do have a blade. Sometimes we'll just use a razor blade. It depends. I don't.
And that doesn't have to be silver plated, right?
Well, I do.
You do, really?
I do, but a lot of scribes don't bother with that. So, and I'm not judging them. And then there's just your regular sort of X-Acto blade knife. So it depends. Sometimes you need to scratch it out. Other times it depends. Sometimes I will use. This is a bit of lava that I got when I was 12 in Hawaii on the beach, and you can see there's little bits of parchment caught in the holes of the lava.
So
that's actually what that is.
What do you do with the lava?
Oh, you scratch it out. You sort of grind it out. You can use glass. Some scribes use glass.
Really?
Some actually are so skillful with these that they can literally like lift out They can literally take like just a layer of skin off basically and lift it out without making too big of a hole. I never learned how to do that, and I'm too scared to, so I don't do it that way.
Wow.
Instead, what I do is I work from the top, and like I said, I might just use a series of different erasers. I have an erasing shield also
when
so that I can...
eraser, you don't mean like on the back of a pencil, like rubber?
No, not like that.
What do you mean?
You can actually use a white plastic eraser because they...
Really?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
And that'll remove ink?
It depends. That's why I usually start with a blade, or I start with something. I use oh, it's over there as well. Sorry, really, really fine sandpaper, like really super fine sandpaper. But you also have to know that the sandpaper is vegan because you don't want the adhesive that's in the paper, right, to not be kosher. I'm not saying that all scribes practice the same way as I do, but that's how I do it. Wow. And it's the same with if you need to do any gluing, like when you're patching a Torah or anything like that, and you have to use any adhesive, you have to make sure that it's not made out of non-kosher animals, because then you've pasuled the whole Torah again. You've made it unfit for ritual use.
Talk to me about the balance between, you said, so some people are upset when you take a 200-year, 300-year-old Torah scroll and you restore it.
Right.
Talk to me about that. Why would they be upset?
Well, so for some people, they feel like the moment that, because it's so old, and it's, let's say it's never been repaired, then everything about it is from that time and from that tradition and from that person, and that's all the materials manufacture, and it's all everything. And the moment I come to it, the moment I put one drop of my ink on it, the ink will have a little bit different recipe. It obviously is from modern times. If the ink has faded, if it fades to sort of like a dark gray or brown or something like that, it's fine. If it's turned red, then it's never been kosher to begin with. So
why was it never kosher to begin with?
Because it has to do, because you're only allowed to use certain, there are different recipes, but you're only allowed to use certain ingredients. But that's just one of the things that we're taught.
What ingredient would be there that would make it unkosher to begin with? Because presumably it's red because of rust.
Well, not necessarily, no. Like, at least in my experience, when I've come across iron gall ink that has corroded, it's actually usually turned sort of like greenish black, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense.
And it's corroded, and it's sort of like become quite crumbly. And then it's...
And you mean actually greenish? Because the greenish would indicate there's copper in there.
Sometimes it's greenish, sometimes it's bluish. But the thing is, so I have to make a caveat. That is, I have tetrachromatic vision, so I actually see like a million more colors than other people because I've got a different combination of like cones and rods and things like that. I see. So I'm not saying that if you looked at it, you could see it. I'm just saying this is what I'm seeing. So I'm seeing, and then when it comes away, like when it crumbles away and it's just the parchment left, you can see the kind of staining because it sits on top of the parchment. It doesn't soak in like with paper. It sits on top of the parchment, which is why you can, use a blade to take it off and not make a hole, for example. So yeah, you can see the sort of like the way the parchment's been stained.
Okay.
Usually it's sort of variations of like a beige or a brown or something like that, but even that can tell you sort of the ink content. But if you add things, it's like the curly pay, as you, because we went there, but then we didn't finish going there. So I've fixed many Torahs where they were full of these beautiful letters from Sefer Tagin, which are supposed to, for you to go, I see this dot here, or I see this particular letter there, and that's supposed to remind me of the lesson of such and such, or that's supposed to be, more information on how to behave or how to be a better person or that sort of thing. So there was a scribe that had gone through this particular Torah and several Torahs that I fixed where they went, oh, well, those aren't considered kosher anymore, or my tradition doesn't recognize those anymore, or never did.
So they removed the curly pays.
They didn't remove them. They just took a really thick quill and they just went, and they just like covered up with a bunch of ink. They just covered up the curl to make one really big, thick, ugly tongue inside the letter instead of a proportionate tongue, which would have been nicer. They didn't take the time to do that. So, so to me, that's a bit like you're destroying our older tradition, which I don't think you should do. This is just my personal opinion. But it's also a bit lazy. But that's good for me because by the time I got this Torah, like another 100 years later or whatever, his ink had started, and I was saying his because 100 years ago, it was very unlikely that a woman would have been fixing this Torah, but not impossible. And his ink had already started to fade because obviously he didn't have very good quality ink. So, so I could see the swirl.
Okay. Did you restore it as a swirl?
Yes, I did, and that took a long time. Well, the thing is, I gave, that's part of like the estimate I gave to the synagogue that owned, any of these Torahs, because like I said, I've seen it many times. I've said, okay, well, there's this. This is how I think about it, and this is why. But at the end of the day, it's your Torah scroll. So if I don't restore all of them, because they're not kosher either way, really. If it used to be kosher, we should leave it that way. Okay. But nowadays, they're not really considered kosher. But it would be really nice to bring back the tradition, I think, and so do several other scribes, male and female scribes. So, so I leave it to them basically.
So you talked before about how there were these innumerable rules, and they're getting more and more strict. And you mentioned Sefer Tagin, so now's a good segue into. You were going to give an example of that from the curly pays. So what are the strict rules that you think, okay, that's overkill?
Oh, sorry. What I meant was like when someone comes along later and they find something to do with Sefer Tagin and they don't accept it, so they write over it so that it's modern looking now, and they've destroyed the Sefer Tagin element. So a curly pay is one example. Another example is there's a couple of kufs, letter kuf. It's where we get the letter Q from eventually in English, because English actually comes from the same place that Hebrew and Arabic and Greek and everything comes from. Now what we see all the time is kuf has a space, right, between its the long descender, right, the long leg, and also its roof. So there's a space there. You have to write a space. There's two instances, it used to be, according to Sefer Tagin, where you would actually have that leg, that descender, like touching the roof. And they were for specific reasons, deliberately, they were for specific reasons, and they were to reflect a particular idea. So a lot of Torahs I've come across, also, some other scribe has gone, oh, that shouldn't be touching, scrape. But now that that's been done, I'm not really supposed to restore it. So that's why I don't like when... But like I said, I'm just speaking from me. I'm not talking about, I'm not saying what the rules are. This is where I'm coming from as a scribe.
Yeah, if it's any consolation, in the Middle Ages, they would restore Torah scrolls every couple hundred years, or I guess we don't really know how often. And when they would do that, they would often systematically go through and change the shapes of certain letters. Like I saw one Torah scroll where every single hey, the left leg was originally touching the roof. And every single instance, except a few where he missed, the restorer came and scraped away, which is chak tuchot. So you're not supposed to do that, but whatever. Who's counting? So it violates a certain obscure rule, which actually is in the Talmud, so it's not that obscure.
Not that obscure.
It's actually
makes it more universal that way,
right? So, but apparently he figured it was better to do that than to leave it. And he did it systematically throughout the scroll, except for a few places where he missed.
You could argue that it was already a letter hey, and then after he scraped, it was still a letter hey.
Well, he scraped it because I think he thought it was a chet, meaning, or he didn't knew it wasn't a chet, but it would be misinterpreted as a chet.
So if he thought, oh, this person put a chet where there should be a hey, and he turned it into a hey from being a chet, then that is chok.
Fair enough. Okay.
But if he thought, oh, it's just one of these old-fashioned hays that we don't consider kosher anymore, because as you know, I mean, hay and chet used to look a lot more similar than they do now.
Yeah, I mean, they still can be confused today, but okay.
Yeah,
especially in the old printed books in the 19th century.
Oh, terrible printing!
Sometimes they're in the printing is so imprecise that they're indistinguishable. Sometimes a hay and a chet.
Really hard,
because the top does touch there.
It's true.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I feel your pain. I'm really into typography as well.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. I didn't realize that I was sitting down with the first certified modern female scribe, and I'm really honored. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nehemia. That's very kind of you to say, and I appreciate you having me on your podcast. And
thank you.
It's been a lot of fun, hasn't it? I can imagine we can geek out about a lot of stuff, actually.
And hopefully we'll have another opportunity to do this.
Yeah.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.